I hope you're enjoying this Memorial Day weekend, and I hope you have the opportunity to take some time this weekend just to reflect, to be grateful, to remember the bravest among us who made the ultimate sacrifice to preserve this nation that we call home. For those of you who are new to this experience, my name is Mark. I'm one of the pastors at Parker Hill Church, and I'm so glad you're spending this time with us online today. Last week, we kicked off this brand new teaching series from the letter of James in the New Testament of the Bible. And as I mentioned last week, James, the author of this letter, was the brother of Jesus, and he was the leader of the first century church in Jerusalem, which was the birthplace of Christianity. And so he wrote this letter to his fellow Christians who were now scattered across the Roman Empire. And there's a theme that's woven throughout this letter. It's the idea that real faith works. In other words, if our faith is authentic, it will not be confined to just an hour a week. If our faith is authentic, it's going to be more than just a church thing. It will permeate every area of our lives. It will change the way we speak, the way we act, the way we respond to our circumstances. Real faith, authentic faith, is a faith that works. And so today we're talking about how our faith works in times of temptation. And as a way of introducing this message, let me begin by telling you about one of the deadliest disasters that has ever occurred in the city of Boston. It happened just over 100 years ago, and it was caused by something that seemed very harmless. On the north end of the city of Boston, there was a huge steel tank. It was owned by the Purity Distilling Company, and it held 2.3 million gallons of molasses. For years, the tank had been leaking, but nobody thought much of it. After all, it was only molasses. In fact, the way the company dealt with the problem was to repaint the tank the same color as the molasses so the leaks wouldn't be so noticeable. But on January 15th, 1919, the tank broke open and sent a 30-foot wave of molasses through the streets, destroying everything in its path. Believe it or not, 21 people died and 150 people were injured. All because of something that most people thought was harmless. Well, today I want to talk about the small cracks in our lives. Those things that may seem harmless that could in fact end up doing great damage to us and to the people around us. James writes this letter to these first century Christians, and in the section we're going to look at today, he shares some important principles about how to deal with the small cracks in our lives before they create big messes. And his words that we're about to read and study, they're like the instruction of a loving father encouraging his son or daughter toward what will keep them safe and lead them into life as God designed it. Let me read the passage for you, then we'll come back and walk through it a little bit more slowly. I'm going to begin in verse 12, which is where we left off last week. Here's where we'll start. Verse 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. We talked about this last week, about trials and suffering. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And then the very next verse begins with these two words, when tempted. Now I want to point this out here because I believe the flow of thought here is very purposeful. James writes about suffering, and then he immediately pivots and he talks about temptation. Because when we're suffering, when we're going through some kind of pain, that's when we are the most susceptible to temptation. When you go through some kind of emotional trauma in your life, you want to reach out for something to heal the pain. And so oftentimes what we do is reach for something to make us feel better, and it ends up trapping us. You know, I think most people who struggle with some kind of addiction, if you could hear their story, you would discover that they began down that path to addiction as a response to some kind of pain. And so James talks about trials, and then he immediately begins to talk to us about the temptations that will look so appealing in those times of trial. Let me keep reading here, verse 13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Now, let me just give you a one-sentence summary of what I think James was saying here. It's just a simple one-sentence principle about the way that life works here in this world. It's this: we never plan our way into destruction, we drift our way into it. Isn't that true? When you see someone's life just kind of blow up, it may appear to be sudden, but it rarely is. Like, nobody wakes up one day and just decides to wreck their life. It's a process that unfolds over time. It's those small cracks in our lives that we ignore, we paint over the surface, and oftentimes we don't know what's happening until it's too late. For example, I don't think anyone has ever said, today I'm going to smoke my first cigarette, and then if I'm lucky, I'll get lung cancer and die by the age of 58. That's my plan. That's what I hope happens to me. Nobody says that. I don't think anybody has ever said, today I'm going to go to Mohegan Sun and try out a slot machine for the first time, and hopefully I can get hooked on gambling, and someday I'll lose all my retirement money and then lose my kids' college fund, and then maybe even have my car repossessed. That's my plan. Nobody says that. Nobody says, I think I'm going to go drink my first beer, and if all goes according to plan, I'll become an alcoholic by the time I'm 23, and then one day I can lose my job, then lose my family, maybe even lose my life. Like, nobody plans for those things to happen, but that kind of stuff happens all the time. So how does that happen? It's simple. We make one choice at a time, take one small step, and then end up somewhere that we never imagined we would be. We never plan our way into destruction. We drift our way into it. And what I love about this passage in the letter that James writes to first century believers and to us is that it helps us understand what we need to do to avoid that path that will lead us to heartache and to stay on the path that will lead us to blessing. So we need to do four things. We need to wake up, we need to own up, we need to wise up, and we need to look up. And we're going to talk about all four of those. First thing we need to do is this: we need to wake up. In other words, we cannot be complacent. We need to be vigilant. Verse 13 begins with those two words again, when tempted. When tempted. And I want to stop and point that out, and maybe point out the obvious, that it doesn't say if tempted, because temptation is not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. Because it's inevitable in this world that we live in. And keep in mind, these words were written almost 2,000 years ago, before the internet and shopping malls and Amazon Prime and casinos and bars. And if it was true then, it's even more true today that we will face temptation every day of our lives in this fallen world. We got to wake up to that truth. Years ago, somebody gave me a written prayer that I thought was kind of cute. It goes like this: I want to thank you, Lord, for being with me so far today. With your help, I haven't been impatient, lost my temper, been grumpy, greedy, anxious, or selfish. But I will be getting out of bed in a minute, and I'll really need your help then. See, every day from the moment we get up in the morning and put our feet on the floor, we're in a battle against temptation. The Bible says even Jesus himself was tempted. And if he was tempted, then certainly we as his followers will be tempted as well. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to wake up. In other words, be vigilant, be prepared. Here's the second thing we're going to do. We're going to own up. If we want to deal with the cracks in our lives and prevent the messes, we're going to own up. Let me keep reading here in verse 13. It says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. I know this is true with me. It's probably true for all of us. Whenever we fail, one of the most common reactions is to find someone or something else to blame for our failure, right? Sometimes even blaming God himself. Reminds me of the guy who was supposedly on a diet, and then one morning he shows up at work with a bag of donuts from his favorite bakery. And he had already eaten several of them before he got to work, and his coworkers gave him a really hard time about this because they knew he was supposed to be on a diet. And he said, wait a minute, you don't understand. He said, on the way to work this morning, I prayed about this. And I said, Lord, if you want me to stop and get some donuts, then show me a sign. If you want me to stop at the bakery, then make sure there's an open parking spot right in front. I prayed that this morning, he said, and sure enough, the seventh time around the block, there was an open parking spot. That's what we do. We're always looking for a way out and then looking for someone else to blame. And the ultimate blame is when we blame God. And do you know that this goes all the way back to the very first temptation that was recorded in the Bible? Genesis 3 describes how Adam and Eve, the first human beings, rebelled against their Creator by eating the forbidden fruit. In Genesis chapter 3, it says this is God speaking. He said, have you eaten, speaking to the man, have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? Like it was a very simple question. It was a yes or no question. Have you done this? Look at the first two words out of his mouth. The man said, the woman. The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. The woman you put here with me, by the way, God, she wasn't my idea. Like when it was just me and the animals, everything was cool back in those days. The woman you put here with me. Then it keeps going. Then the Lord God said to the woman, what is this you have done? The woman said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. So the man blames the woman blames the serpent, and obviously the serpent didn't have, as they say, a leg to stand on. See, blame has been our go-to response ever since the very beginning of time. And when we shift the blame, ultimately what we're doing in a very subtle way is we're blaming God himself. Like, it's not my fault. It's just my personality. It's just the way I am. In other words, just the way God made me. It's not my fault. It's my family background. It's the way I was raised. It's, the parents God gave me. It's not my fault. It was the circumstances. I mean, anyone would have done the same thing in my situation. I couldn't help it. In other words, God allowed me to be in this set of circumstances. James says, listen, when temptation comes your way, don't look for someone or something else to blame, especially not God. Just own up. Let me tell you why that's so important, and I'll illustrate it this way. When I was in college, I had a friend who loved to golf, and he was very good at golfing. Played golf all through high school. And he talked me one semester, and it only lasted one semester, he talked me into going golfing with him. And so I bought an old set of golf clubs at a flea market nearby here, and they were like 30 years old, and we would go golfing a couple of times a week. I was hoping to actually get good at it. Never happened. We were at a driving range one afternoon, and he was hitting every ball, like 250 yards. He was just crushing it. He was just killing it. And I was doing my best, but every time I hit the ball, it would bounce about 30 yards out into the driving range. And it was kind of frustrating, a little bit embarrassing. And I finally said, the problem is these golf clubs. If I had a really good set of clubs like yours, then I'd probably be really good at this. He said, well, let me try them. And he took the driver and he looked it over, and then he set the ball on the tee and he took a swing and he drove that thing like 250 yards in a straight line like a rifle shot. Then he handed the club back to me and he said, seems fine to me. Then he shared a piece of advice he had heard from his high school golf coach. He said, if you always blame the club, you're never going to work on your swing. And see, the problem is some of us keep blaming everyone and everything else for our failures, and so we never change the choices we make, and we just stay on that path that ultimately leads to a mess. So James says, listen, we got to wake up, and we need to own up. And the third thing is this: we need to wise up. In other words, we need to understand how the process of temptation plays out so that we can recognize it. And it's a very predictable process. In the next couple of verses here, verses 14 and 15, we find, I think, one of the best explanations anywhere in the Bible of how the process of temptation plays itself out in our lives. We'll go down to verse 14. When tempted, I'll start back in 13. No one should say, God is tempting me, okay? Own up. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But, and here's how it works, each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire. Now, you see the word desire there. What's the word that comes right before it? It's the word evil. It's important to see that because you need to know that desire in and of itself is not wrong. On the contrary, desire is good. God is pro-desire. I mean, he's the one who created us with our desires. He gave us the desire to eat and drink, the desire to feel joy and pleasure, the desire for success, the desire for sexual intimacy. Those are all good, God-given desires. The problem is that our good desires can become evil desires. Now, how do good desires become evil desires? Very simply, a good desire becomes an evil desire when that desire takes the place of God in our lives. When we look to that desire to fill an emptiness inside of us that only God can fill. When we take a good thing and make it a God thing, then it becomes a bad thing, an evil desire. For example, hunger is a God-given desire, but that God-given desire for nourishment can eventually turn into using food as a coping mechanism, right? And when we get sad or we get stressed, then we drown our sorrows in a half gallon of chocolate ice cream. And we have a phrase for this. We call it comfort food because we look for comfort in food instead of looking for comfort in God. And so a good desire can be changed into an evil desire. Or you get depressed. And so you go to the mall and you buy something. Or, in my case, you go to Home Depot and buy something. And you come home feeling a little bit better because it seems to fill the emptiness in your heart. We have a word for that, a phrase for that. We call it retail therapy, because shopping is filling the emptiness that God should fill. There's another God-given desire, which is sexual desire, right? But for millions of people today, that desire has become a desire that defines them. So it all begins with these desires that become distorted, and they take the place of God. Let me go back to verse 14 and continue here. Each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire. And then here's the next word, enticed. It's a fascinating word. In the original Greek language in which the New Testament was written, that word has a very interesting background. It was often used to describe the process of hunting or fishing. The word entice literally means this. It means to catch with bait. And I think that is such an accurate picture of how temptation operates in our lives, right? We get deceived. We see the bait, but we don't see the hook behind it. We see the short-term pleasure, but we don't see the long-term pain. Let me illustrate this idea, but rather than talking about us, human beings, let's talk for a moment about bugs and rodents. Like if we have bugs in our home, if we have ants in our homes and we want to get rid of them, what we do is we appeal to their desire and we practice deception. So this is an ant restaurant, okay? At least the ants think it's a restaurant because there's some food in here. And the ants think it's going to be a really good meal, but it will be their last meal. And so you appeal to the ant's desire for food and you deceive the ant into thinking that it's going to get a good meal, but the end result is destruction. Here's another example. This is what's called a glue trap. And I'm told that there's an odor that it emits. And mice can smell that odor and they think it's a very pleasant odor. And so they venture in, and this thing is really sticky, and they venture in to check it out. But once they go there, they never leave. Like they check in, but they don't check out. Like Satan has been using this strategy for thousands of years. And the strategy is really quite simple. Get you so focused on what you want that you don't notice the trap that you're walking into. Let me keep reading. It goes on to describe the process, verse 15. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And this is kind of a new word picture here. He's using the picture of childbearing. Like desire, once you've been enticed, conceives and it gives birth to a decision. And we actually take a step of action and we do something wrong. That deception leads to conception, which leads to action. And then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, listen to this, when it is full grown. It's a fascinating word picture. Like it starts out as a baby, but then when this sin, when this habit is full grown, it overpowers you like your kids eventually do. And it gets a hold on you, and even though you know it's wrong, and even though you know it could hurt you, you just continue to hold on to it. I was on an airline flight. This was a while back, and I don't pay much attention to the flight attendants because I've heard the speech before. And so when they do their speech, I usually tune them out. But on this particular flight, I was paying attention. I guess I was bored. I don't know why, but near the end of the flight, they came on the PA system and said, ladies and gentlemen, please secure your tray tables and put your seat in the upright lock position. And then they said, and a flight attendant will be coming through the cabin to collect any unwanted garbage. To collect any unwanted garbage. And there was something about that phrase that caught my attention. I don't know, maybe I was overthinking it, maybe I was just tired, but I thought, is there such a thing as wanted garbage? And you know, God can speak to you through anything, I believe, and it's almost as if I sense God saying, yes, there is such a thing as wanted garbage, and you have some in your life. It's that stuff that you want to hold on to, that you just need to throw away. And when James uses this phrase here, that sin becomes full grown, I believe he's describing what we might call a habit or an addiction. And normally when we think about the subject of addictions, we normally think of addiction to drugs or alcohol, and certainly those are some of the most serious and most destructive addictions, but not the only ones, because addiction doesn't have to be that dramatic. You can become addicted to food. We eat to make ourselves feel better, to deal with the stress and the sadness in our lives. You can be addicted to shopping. You know, you spend hours shopping, looking for something that will make you feel good for a little while, or technology. You probably know someone that you might describe as being addicted to their smartphone or their Xbox. And I mention those things because I think it's really easy to be critical about other people's habits and addictions, but to be completely blind to your own. And so sin, when it is full grown, and let me read the rest of the passage here. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. And see, when the Bible talks about death, it doesn't always refer to physical, literal death. There are many kinds of death. There's the death of a reputation, the death of a family unit, the death of a relationship. There's that spiritual deadness that settles into your heart, a kind of shame. And so James, he describes this pathway that just begins with desire that gets twisted, and then deception sets in, and we don't see the trap, and we take action, and that action leads to a form of compulsion or habit or addiction that can eventually lead us to destruction. And here's the amazing thing. This is not new information. Like, we all know this. We've all seen this play out, at least in the lives of other people. But see, we think that this process doesn't apply to us, that we're like different, we're smarter, we're stronger, we're slicker. That's why James goes on in verse 16 to give this plea. He says, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Don't allow yourself to be led down a path one step at a time that will bring you to a place of disaster. So James says, listen, we got to wake up. We got to own up. We got to wise up. And finally, we need to do one more thing. We need to look up. We need to look beyond the immediate temptation and see something even better. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. In other words, the best gifts in life are those that come from God. He wants to give us good and perfect gifts. He's not a God who changes like shifting shadows. He will not deceive us. He will always lead us toward what is best for us. And because of that, we need to keep our attention focused on Him. Trust His promises, follow His ways, so that we're not pulled away by the fake attractions and the empty promises of this world. Let me say it one more time. We never plan our way into destruction. We drift our way into it. Or we never fall into sin. We drift into sin. And that is so true. And that's why James says, listen, here's what we got to do. We got to wake up. We got to own up. We got to wise up, and we got to look up. Now, before I bring this message in for a landing, I just want to speak a word of grace that some of you may need to hear today. Because I know you can listen to a message like this sometimes and feel defeated. I mean, some of you wish you could turn back the clock 5 or 10 years and, do some things differently. Many of us feel that way. And see, the tension of giving a message like this is that I realize that I'm not speaking to perfect people. And I'm not speaking as a perfect person. And so in some sense, it can be discouraging to hear a message like this because, there's already so much water under the bridge. But let me say this, no matter where you find yourself today, God is with you, He is for you. He can forgive, He can restore, He can even leverage our bad decisions and use them for His good purposes. So listen, if you're not dead, God's not done with you. Just decide, God, from this day forward, I want to honor you, I want to walk with you, I want to love you, I want to follow you. So let me close with a challenge, a word of encouragement for all of us. This comes from a writer named Herb Caen, who used to write for the San Francisco Chronicle. And in one of his newspaper columns, he wrote this. I love this. He said, "Every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up. It knows it must run faster than the fastest lion or it will be killed. Every morning, a lion wakes up. It knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle or it will starve to death. It doesn't matter whether you're a lion or a gazelle, when the sun comes up, you'd better be running." And we live in a world where we have to wake up every morning and be ready to run into the safety of God's love and His wisdom so that we can live a life of peace and blessing and joy. Hey, don't go anywhere. Steve, our campus pastor at the Dixon City campus, Steve Brown, is going to come back and wrap things up with you. We'll see you again next week.